So in this video, I'm going to talk about Tom Tyler's essay, From Harm Reduction to Community Engagement, Redefining the Goals of Police in the 21st Century. So he's basically coming from this perspective that we have to really redefine the goals of policing in order to reform police actions and the police as an institution, right? So we have to, the public, and there's a growing dissatisfaction with the police where over 40% of people do not trust the police. And so they have to then really radically kind of change how they're functioning and how they're running their police departments. And of course, there's also a racial gap in terms of trusting the police, where you have more white people trusting the police and you have less people of color trusting the police. And there's kind of just overall, though, a growing scrutiny of the police, given how with social media, more people can kind of share their experiences. You have more people sharing videos of civilian police encounters. And so individuals who might be more privileged and may not really have experiences with the police are now being exposed to what's happening with the police, for example, in more urban, lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods. And so that's why you have this growing distrust of the police from people of all socioeconomic statuses, even though there is still that race gap. So the police departments, the police as an institution typically functions with the harm reduction principle. So their overall goal is to decrease crime, right? And so unfortunately, that reduction of crime leads to there being a focus on these violent crimes and gun-related crimes, which disproportionately happen within urban communities. And then you have more of a police force in these urban communities and then a growing distrust of it. And so many people in these communities don't trust the police, right? And the author talks about these examples of stop and frisk policy, where there's a focus on certain neighborhoods, certain people within these neighborhoods, and it leads to racial profiling, where if someone is suspected, then the police can basically, pull them over and check them to see if they have weapons or drugs on them. And that, of course, leads to less trust of the police. And oftentimes these individuals statistically are innocent. So you have a greater police presence and then you have less trust of the police. So it's not really a good thing that's happening with greater police presence within these urban communities. And so, of course, you have to think about the humiliation and alienation that happens from the people who are experiencing stop and frisk. It lowers public trust. It leads to cynicism about the police, and it's not just from the people in these communities, it's society at large. So clearly there, is more of a coercion and force being used, and less people are trusting the police, and the police are using more weapons. And so what have been the responses, right, to a growing distrust of the police? Well, the author says, there should be a minimization of police investigatory contacts with the public. So research shows that these expansions of the range and scope of policing are actually not really helpful with reducing crime, and it ends up leading to just more people not wanting to follow what the police is saying or what they're doing. And so the procedural style of policing, being command and control and using force, is just leading to suspicion, and it leads people to be viewed as criminals and lead to racial profiling if there's stop and frisk policies being used, or if they're expanding their role within certain urban communities. So people end up fearing the police and wanting to avoid them instead of trusting them. And so the author also talks about how there have been changes in the police over time in terms of how they exist and how they handle situations. So police more so nowadays use instrumental mechanisms like more intense weapons to control people, versus the older tradition of what he says as street corner politician style policing, where these police officers had more interactions and relationships within the community. So they were a lot more effective because they were managing conflicts within the community rather than being very coercive and using force. So the police should see themselves as more of providing a service rather than forcing people to do things. And so if we're thinking about reducing crime has to also be correlated with building more social and economic and political capital within a neighborhood. You can't necessarily just have greater police presence and then not do anything else about the problems that are happening. You have to have more opportunities for people, because poverty and crime is always intertwined. And there should be more of a trust between people and their government. But people will cooperate with the police if they view the police being more fair and legitimate, and they also feel more of an ownership in their communities rather than feeling alienated from their communities. So you have more, if you have more resources in the communities and more of like a democratic way of policing in these communities, then more people are more likely to care about their communities and report crimes and cooperate and work with the police. And also that should happen if you have less aggressive policing and if police don't have as much of flexibility when it comes to lower level crimes, as the author talks about. They have a lot of flexibility with how they interact with that. And the author says, instead of, arresting people for minor crimes, there should be a focus on not arresting these people and providing them more with social services and therapy and counseling and things like that rather than arresting them. So what are some of these concrete changes then that the author talks about when it comes to redefining the goals of policing? So in order to transform the police and these goals, you have to change the composition of the police force. It has to be way more diverse when it comes to race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. You have to change police culture from being very hierarchical. The training has to be ongoing. There has to be constant education. The police leaders have to be fair to their police officers. There has to be changes with their external policies where you walk away from that whole model of militarizing the police in schools where they're heavily armed, and they should be interacting with civilians in more democratic ways rather than solely punitive ways. There also needs to be changes with their internal styles of policing. So oftentimes officers felt that their departments were unfair and then they viewed themselves as not being legitimate, or they're more likely to use force on the street. If they view themselves as being treated fairly, then they're more likely to treat the people they're interacting with fairly. They should also be recognized and rewarded consistently for helping the community. The metrics should not just be about reduction in crime, but it should also be about helping the community, building relationships with the community, right? So there needs to be a larger system-wide change where there has to be changes throughout all of the different aspects of policing, from the court cases, right, pre-trial engagement, to initial police contracts, to training, to these various processes within the legal system too. So overall, then, the author's point is that you have to change from a deterrence harm reduction model to more of a democratic community engagement approach with policing. And that way more people will trust the police. You also at the same time have to have more social economic resources given to these communities that are heavily policed. And that means more people will have more pride in their community and will be more cooperative with the police. And the police then interacting with people beyond punitive measures, right, that will lead to more trust within the community rather than undermining it.